is about Rabenu Tam's tefillin, Rashi's and Rabenu Tam's tefillin, and we have a lashon on the right. You have a lashon of the Alter Rebbe. Before we read the lashon of the Alter Rebbe, the pasuk says, that the tefillin should be between your eyes. And we know that the Tzidokim, they took this literally, and they would have that tefillin between their eyes. And the halacha is not like that. Chazal learned from Psukim, just like by korcha, the issur of ripping out your hair in grief. It says, and so you can't rip out hair on the forehead or in the over here with the bridge of the nose, because it's not a mokim where hair grows in abundance. Therefore, we understand that the mokim hatfilin bein einecho is on the above the hairline, so it's bein einecho. But exactly how where the to be mamish on the center, that doesn't have a strong source in halacha. There is actually very interesting in the Levush. He says that the kesher of tefillin, there's a lashon in Chazal neged bein einecha. Now, might be a bit surprising, but if you look at a person standing here erect, the top of the neck, where the neck meets the skull, where the kesher rosh is the same level as your eyes. Your eyes are in the half the size of the skull, of the head, from the chin till the top of the skull. Halfway, that's where the eyes are, and the top of the neck is actually level to bein einecha. So it's neged bein einecha. So the Levush says mamish neged bein einecha. But still that's talking about the height, and that's talking about the kesher, about the placement of the tefillin. They have to be mamish in the middle, not a little bit to one side. Is not so evident, to the point that you have a famous shuvah from the Tzanzorov and Divrei Chaim, where he says that people who use a mirror to see that the tefillin should be in the middle he says is boirus, it's an ignorant behavior, and he supports this because it says in Gemara when Erevi we had it not. We said mokin yesh berosh lishnei tefillin. So there's place for two tefillin. So he understood that the two tefillin are side by side. Obviously, we generally follow it the other way around. There's one behind the other. But it's not so strongly evident. There's not such strong evidence that the tefillin have to be in the center. And here we have the Alter Rebbe has a lashon that emphasizing the tefillin have to be in the center. So let's read this inside. This is the lashon of the Siddur. It's not in the Shulchan Aruch. It's in the Siddur, which the Alter Rebbe published in his lifetime, and it has a lot of chidushim in it. What's the proof that the tefillin have to be mamish in the middle? Because it says in pasuk. It says in Gemara. The two parshas of Kadesh v'Hoy Kiviyach have to be on the right side. Shema v'Hoy Shemayim Yismael, and the two parshas of Shema v'Hoy Shemayim should be on the left side. Of the tefillin the Rashi, Shapashis Kesidron, in the tefillin the Rashi, the way the parshas are in the order as they appear in Torah, not like Rabenu Tam, which we'll discuss in a moment. Ein bein yamin lismoil elamashu. There's only a fraction of space between the left and the right. Dahainu, what is the gap between left and right? Hacharitz, the groove in the compartments of the tefillin. Shebein v'hoya kiviyach lishma. Al kein tzorch lizor b'zeh. Therefore, one has to be very careful. So let's take a look at the diagram which I managed to borrow from some sefer. And so we've got here a diagram showing the four parshas of a tefillin. Now, just to clarify, we've got those arrows at the top, Yamin HaKoirei, Smoil HaKoirei, etc. When we talk about from right to left, that we're following not the wearer, the right of the wearer, but the right of the one who's looking opposite, from opposite. So, Kadesh, so this is the if you're looking at the tefillin, so you'll see Kadesh first, and then V'hoyo ki yiviyach. Then, according to Rashi, it then goes on to Shema, and then it goes to V'hoyem Shemoy. Rabenu Tam says, Kadesh V'hoya Kiviyachi agrees with Rashi, but then Shema, and then V'hoya Shema is the outer parsha, and V'hoya Shemoya is the inner one. So if you'd go in sequence, it'll be 1, 2, 4, 3. Whereas in Rashi, in the sequence as they appear in Torah, Kadesh V'hoya Kiviyacho is in Parshas Boy, then Shema is in Parshas V'eschanan, V'hoya Shemoya is Parshas Akev. So it's in the sequence as it appears in Torah. So now the Alter Rebbe is looking at Rashi's tefillin, and he's saying we must say that the space which you have, the tefillin have to be mamash in the center. Why? So I'd written this, and I want to clarify because it seems to be misunderstood. When we have this lashon, mi min and mismoil, what does the word mi min mean? It's actually a bit ambiguous, and I believe that is the machlokas between Rashi and Rabenu Tam. Mi min can mean on the right or from the right. And mismoil can mean on the left or from the left. And Rashi says, mi min means these two parashas are on the right. Kadesh v'hoya kiviyacha are on the right. Shema v'hoyim shemaya are on the left. Now the distance between your right and your left is a fraction. If these two parashas have to be on the right of the person, and these two parashas have to be on the left of the person, so what space do you have to play with? You only have the thickness of the leather, so to speak, which is and the groove really. Right? Alter Rebbe says the charitz, the groove which is between the two, which is mamash. Halavai, it would be even a millimeter. It's less. It's a fraction. Okay. I call upon him not going into the thickness of the leather, but at least the parashas. Some Alter Rebbe talks about the charitz, but the parashas these have to be on the right. Rabenu Tam says Shema v'hoyim shemoya. He says we're going to start from. Now let's read. Kadesh mimin from the right. We'll start from the right and then we'll proceed inwards. Shema v'hoyim shemoya, mismoil will start from the left and proceed inwards. So according to Rabenu Tam, so long as the Shema has started on the left, it's not imperative, evidently, that v'hoyim shemoya has to be on the right or on the left of the person. It can, so long as you started, the Shema has started on the left, and Kaddish has started on the right, so then you're good. So that's what the Alter Rebbe is saying, that the evidence that the tefillin have to be mamish be'emtza is particularly according to Rashi. That's what he says, bitfillin de Rashi. According to this, it would follow that it's not so vital in Rabenu Tam's to have them be'emtza. Of course, they have to be broadly, but to be so fussy about this, maybe there's room for a bit of leniency. Having said that, having understood the difference between Rashi, Rabenu Tam, and the evidence, but then we have the story of the Alter Rebbe when he was arrested, and when the Alter Rebbe came to the Cancelleria, he came into the office, the chancellery. I don't know what do we call it, chancellery. They started laughing because people had the accusation of against the Alter Rebbe was that he's trying to overthrow the Tsar, and they saw this fine Haley Kayid didn't look anything like a person designing to take over the king, the Tsar. Then he says the following: Hatalas vatfilin hoya beyoda shel admur azok. The Alter Rebbe, he had in his hand, his talis and tefillin. As he's in the office there, he started putting Rabenu Tam's. When he put on his head tefillin, he bit in a dekel von a silberne pushke, and he took out from his talis bag. He had the lid of a silver box, a silver snuff box. He just checked to see that his tefillin are accurately in the middle. But not a Rosh Lekano, he looked this way and that way. Is there was his gestanden loyhoyo yochel leishem, and there was his gesessen loyhoyo yochel lamed. The people were so entranced, whoever was standing couldn't sit, those who couldn't sit were sitting couldn't stand. V'yomer Admor Azokin, says Vero Kolami Haaretz Kishem that the Gemara says the nations of their world will see the Yidden wearing the tefillin and they will be taken over by fear. They'll stand like a bottle. They become like jelly. So a couple of, just to add to the story, number one is, what's this lid? So there's a story of a chassid who wanted to give the Alter Rebbe a gift. So he gave him a snuff box. And the Alter Rebbe would always speak in a sing-song. Hey, neighbors, voran bei einem Menschen, was hat nicht geteive, will man das euch anstoppen. There's one organ of a person which doesn't have a drive, doesn't have a passion. I must smell this. You don't have, you're hungry, you want to taste food, you want to look at things, but the nose doesn't have a passion. I want to smell things. You enjoy it when it comes, but it's not as if you have a drive for it. So the Alter Rebbe says, one little organ of a person, and now you want to stuff that one also with a pataiva. So he didn't want to use a snuff box. So then he took the lid, he pulled out the bar of the hinge, and he used the lid of the snuff box to use it to keep his tefillin, to check on his tefillin. But the chiddush is, this story is mentioned in Kutasichas, but here in the Rishimis, it says it was Rabenu Tam's tefillin, which is not so well known. But just I'm bringing this story to show that the Alter Rebbe, despite the lomdas, which you just said, he was particular with the Rabenu Tams also that they should be dafka in the middle. Then there's also another piece of information about this story, that when the Chassidim asked the Alter Rebbe, why is it that we wear the tefillin and we don't see that this has this amazing effect on the goyim around us? The Alter Rebbe says, the lashon of the Gemara is, Te'elu tefillin shebereish. It doesn't tefillin say tefillin she'al hareish, it's tefillin shebereish, the tefillin which are in the head. So if the tefillin are just a superficial thing, it may not have this effect. When it's bereish, which is in the head, so then it becomes part of you and it has that tremendous effect. So meanwhile, so just to summarize this point, that there is in Lomdus the proof that the tefillin have to be mamish in the middle, to the point of using a mirror to see that it's in the middle. That is particularly from Rashi's tefillin, but Lamaisa, we also are noihig to be medayik, in particular, also in Rabenu Tam's, they should be in the middle, as we see the story of the Alter Rebbe. Let's go on. Let's go on to our next point, and that is, okay, someone, I was checking a piece of an article, and it came up this week about the article is actually on Chabad.org. They have a whole series on the Lamates Malachas. So now they're on for Kosev and Moichik, the Malacha of writing and the Malacha of erasing. So as a practical example, it came up about eating biscuits or food, chocolate, let's say, which has writing on it. And just to tell you what caught my attention, that the article the writer had written that to break a biscuit with your fingers is which has got writing, it shouldn't be done, but to put the whole thing in your mouth with the writing is okay. And he's quoting from Rav Forkash. Rav Forkash has got a series now of 4 Sfarim, Shabbos Halacha. In volume 3, that's his conclusion. He's basing upon Reb Chaim Noah, but I'd like to go through this carefully. And so let's go first through the Shulchan Aruch. This is in Siman Shein Mem. That's Sif Gimel. It talks about erasing ink from a parchment. And then in the Rashi writing, that's the Ramo. Says the Ramo, Osur lishbeir ugois. You're not allowed to break on Shabbos, you're not allowed to break cookies. She kesuvois olov, kemin oisis, which have writing on it. Afal pishein mechaven rak la'achilo, even though you're just interested in eating. Dahavi moichik, it's a form of erasing. You're by eating, by breaking the cookie, which is the writing, you're erasing. This is the Ramo. The source is in the Mordechai, which I think is in the name of Marami Rutenburg, and it seems to be related. I may have mentioned it not too long ago, where they would do the Hachnosa L'Cheder, and they would do it on Shavuos, and it was the issue of giving the children. You know, when you bring a children to the Cheder, they have psukim on the cake, and so it came up. They're bringing the children to the Hachnosa L'Cheder. on Shavuos, and they're giving the children the cakes which have got the writing on it. But meanwhile, are you interested in the writing or not? So meanwhile, Maariv is saying, the Ramo is saying, you shouldn't break a cookie, even though you're just interested in eating. To explain, with the children, they have a kavona that the child should eat a cake which has a shtickle posuk. So there's a kavona, psasgula, to have that posuk on the cake. But here it could be stam. That he says, even you're not interested in the writing. And he says it's moichik, by erasing the writing. So we have the melochem in HaTorah is, moichik almanas lichtoib, to clear space to write. And then moichik shaloy almanas lichtoib, to erase with no intention of writing, is obviously not awesome in HaTorah. But here that he says, the Ramo says it's awesome in Rabban. We go then further. Then the next thing beneath that is a quote from the Magen Avraham. He's quoting from Marash Halevi. He says like this: the objection is only when the material of the script is a different material to the cookie, like icing on a cake. But if the writing is part and parcel of the material of the cake itself, in other words, engraved or embossed, it makes no difference. Bitfus oy biyodayim, important point. Bitfus, which means you're using a mold to bang on it, and that creates probably engraved. Oy biyodayim, you can perhaps pinch it to create a letters. Shori. He says the Magen Avraham from the Marash Halevi, that's okay. That's not a problem. That's why people do eat on Shabbos and Yom Tov cookies which have got designs, which have pictures. Before we go further, we learn doch ein bisschen Chassidus eichet. What's stronger, Eisis HaChakike or Eisis HaKsive? Engraved lettering or writing with ink? So we learn in Chassidus, we're going to do with the Luchas, the Eisis HaChakike is a stronger writing than Eisis HaKsive. So how can you come up with a svara to say that engraved letters in the cookie is less than if they were written with icing, with a different material? And the explanation is poshet. I agree that engraved writing is a stronger form of writing. But we're not talking about koisi, we're talking about moichik. And we're saying if you're allowed to eat the cookies, and then person will say, I erased this writing, you might come to erase other writing. The temptation, the likelihood of erasing oisius haksiva is much closer than coming to erase oisius hachakika. So that could be the svara which he's saying for what he's saying here. That because, we're saying don't eat the icing on a cookie, the writing on a cake, because it's moichik. No, if there's icing which says on it with chocolate icing on a white surface, let's say, there's more of a concern of moichik. It looks more like moichik to rewrite on the surface. Engraved letters is less likely. Possibly might be other svaras. Be that as it may, this is the Shulchan, this is the Ramo, this is the Magen Avraham. Lower down, for me it's a bit of a struggle to read, I hope you can. It's in the Shulchan Aruch, we have on the margin, we have comments from the Noida Behuda, and his comments are under the name Dogul Mirvava. He's gotten various parts of Shulchan Aruch, and so he writes the following, it's part of a long note, but this is the part which I want to focus on. He brings various heterim for eating these cookies. And he introduces a new concept. If you're not breaking the cookie with your fingers, with your hands, you're just putting it in your mouth and eating it, so that's for sure should be okay, should be permitted. Because it's erasing with no intention of writing. So he says that's okay. He has a whole discussion earlier where the psik reisha applies by Isha the Rabbanon. Let's not get into it. So meanwhile, we've seen here that Ramah says not to break the cookies when you're eating them. The Magen Avraham brings us to differentiate between Oisis HaChakike and Oisis HaKsiva. The Noide Behuda in Dogel Mervova, he introduces if you're eating it, Derech Achila, it's okay. All right, let's now move over to the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch. This is also in Simon Mem, so that's on the left of the page. So the Alter Rebbe writes, erasing with no intention of writing is also midrabanon. That's why you're not allowed to break a piece of cake which has got letters on it. Even though you're just not interested in the writing, you just want to eat. Then he says, I will put a little in a tunic and give it to a child because the child is doing it lahana also. You don't have to be mafresh. Okay. So what's is very remarkable. The Alter Rebbe, as a general policy, which we could say he saw himself as a malakate to a large degree, to collate the poskim before him, the words of the poskim before him. Particularly, we know that he had a special respect for the Magen Avraham. So he writes the words almost verbatim of the Ramah. We have a problem of breaking the uga, the cookie, which and you're eating it with the writing. So it's a drabanan. Then he doesn't mention that there's a difference between engraved writing or not engraved writing. So he's ignored that change, that comment of the Magen Avraham has been ignored by the Alter Rebbe. So I'm sure many of those who are listening know the Rosh Hashiva in Melbourne called Rabenu Tam. So when he was a young man, so he was analyzing this halacha, and he wrote up a svara, the fact that the Alter Rebbe doesn't bring the distinction between engraved lettering or a separate, with the ink, with the icing, is a proof that the Alter Rebbe disagrees and rejects this distinction. He wrote it into the Rebbe, and now on the lower part of this page, on the screen, you can see here, this is a quote from Rabbi Cohen's Kuntras Yismach Yisrael, where he writes this down. And he had mentioned this to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe answers him, Harei heim divrei haramo. The Alter Rebbe is almost word for word from the Ramah. Now, this is the very surprising piece. There's numerous places. There are many places where the Magen Avraham, the classic commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, they make distinctions, and the Alter Rebbe doesn't quote their distinctions. Look at that. The Rebbe says, I'm baffled, perhaps. I don't know what are the rules, what's the reasons, but the Rebbe rejects this kind of approach that because the Alter Rebbe didn't bring it, is that he doesn't agree. So it could be, even though the Alter Rebbe doesn't bring the distinction between engraved or not, could be he does agree with it. Perhaps he does go along with it. That's as far as we can read in Shimon Mem. The problem is, though, that this comes up in those who have recently learned Gemara Psochim. We'll know that there's a discussion in Gemara Psochim about making matzahs. And there was a question of making designs on the matzahs. And there's also, it brought in Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch and Siman Tov Nun Ches. There used to be a minhag of making a mark on the matzah. This is the Kohen matzah, this is the Levi matzah, and this is the Yisrael matzah. They'd have markings on the matzahs. Now, the Rebbe talks about it, but he says that don't make those markings with letters, because it's then there's going to be an issue of eating the matzahs. Going to be all right. So there we see, although the matzahs is obviously engraved writing, and he still has a problem with it. So although from Shin Mem is not so evident, All right. So the Alter Rebbe looks like from Hilchos Pesach that he holds that the distinction of engraved writing or not engraved writing makes no difference. So then we have what's the other heter? So we just said that the Neder Yehuda says there's a difference whether you're eating or not. Okay, so now let's go on to our next quote. Okay. Here in Siman Shin Mem Gimel, it's talking about chinuch and giving a child non-kosher food. And the Alter Rebbe opens Sif Yud and saying that is only about food or other isurim. If it's an isur like chometz and pesach, which is an isur of food, which has got to do with aval muter litein latinek v'shabbos chafotzim sheyochel lasis behem melocha le'atzmoi. You are allowed to give a child something which he would do a melacha with. And he says an example, he says you're not allowed to eat it on Shabbos. So whereas in Shimem Gimel he had said but here it says and I looked up the Mordechai where the source of this whole thing says it talks about ochla. So although the Ramah uses the words of lishbe, of breaking, but we're seeing earlier and later that the Isur is, it doesn't matter whether it's breaking before eating or during or eating it, putting it in your mouth. There doesn't seem to be a difference, at least according to the Alter Rebbe. Again, the Noida Behuda does make that distinction, and the Mishnah Brura therefore follows him, but the Alter Rebbe doesn't seem to buy that distinction. So what we're remaining with is that we would not make a difference between Oises Achika or not. We wouldn't make a difference between his Derech Achila or not. And actually, I don't see any logic at all. I actually wrote to Rav Forkash, and he apologized that it's 10 years ago since he wrote this piece of halacha. Give me an explanation. What's the difference if the Alter Rebbe does not bring the Noida Behuda? What's the difference whether I break the cookie in my mouth or out of my mouth? I don't see any difference. And on the contrary, if you put that piece of chocolate in your mouth, it's got written on it Kamil Bloch, and then it's engraved, embossed, doesn't matter. Then you take it out after, and Kamil Bloch has gone Kader Kol Haaretz. So you've erased the writing, and then you now got a blank piece of chocolate. Upon him, I don't see any, and actually I would like to just add, which I've given you a reference to on the sheet, that you also have another very great Talmud Chacham in Lubavitch by the name of Rebero Levin. He published a series of Svarim, two Svarim called Shiurei Halocha Lamaisa, and he goes through this. He's the editor of the new edition of the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, and he goes through this and he comes to the same conclusion. There's no difference between eating, according to the Alter Rebbe. Of course, there are other poskim, but we're talking about the Alter Rebbe. I don't see any difference between writing on a piece of chocolate that you put in your mouth at once, or a biscuit which you break in your hand. Okay. I once had how much I want to share with you. Someone's writing about Rov Poskim. I had once a bit of a challenge from Rabbi Yossel Padras as Angesund. He said to me, he asks me, how come that Lubavitch Paskin like the Alter Rebbe, sometimes it's against Rov Poskim? So the Alter Rebbe is a Das Yochid. So how do you Paskin like a Das Yochid and like an individual against the majority? So he said, he's a Yochid, but Ravim tzrichim lei. He's a Yochid, but there's a Rabbim who are dependent upon him. He quoted it afterwards. He liked it. Okay, let's go on to our next question. Okay, here's an interesting question. A family, this is a question from someone overseas. They're going on holiday and they found a place, a nice cottage, which has an open air swimming pool. And they, from family, so they're not going to have a mixed men and women's swimming session. They're going to have separate times. The men will swim separately. The women will swim separately. The girls, whatever. The only problem is because it's an open air pool, well, there's a neighbor. There's a neighbor, and he says the neighbor actually in my last conversation, I didn't give him an answer in a rush because it's a grace of Chiddush here. He says a neighbor could look with a pair of binoculars. It's not like a neighbor from the 2 floors up. The neighbor is so far, if he would look through binoculars, he'll be able to see more detail. So what is the question here? I want to go swimming in my own pool, in my own premises, and there may be someone snooping on me. Am I exposing myself legitimately, or is it wrong what I'm doing? That's really the question. So I looked around, and this is what I found. Actually, there's a few sforim which are specialized on holiday making. There's a sefer called Vahibin Soya. There's a sefer called Ahalich Bamitecho. There's another one. I have a couple of sforim, the one in Shul. They don't comment on this. It's interesting. They don't make any comment. I mean, I was in Italy and I was driving up the coast from the Astrogin place till the airport. Hadn't been in mikveh for a couple of days. We stopped off and we used the sea. What are the parameters for such a thing? So there we go. So here we have, the only place I could find was in the Dinim of Beis HaKiseh, in Siman Gimel, the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, and Shemachab and Shulchan Aruch. It's all the same. There's not much difference. If a person is relieving himself in a mokim megula, in an exposed place, so tzorach leisrachik, he has to be so distant that he should be so distant that someone else should not see his being exposed. That which he reveals when he needs to relieve himself. But he doesn't have to be totally out of sight. So what we're seeing here is that there is a degree of exposure which is permitted in the circumstances. The fact that someone from far away could see a general profile but not see detail, that seems to be acceptable. So I think certainly the story with the fellow being able to see only with the binoculars, I think I don't think that's a reason not to use the swimming pool in this case. Okay. Someone mentions about the midrashim about David and Bathsheba. I want to share with you, since you mentioned that, a moirdike word. It says, I think, the Zohar. L'chol levadcha chotosi v'hora b'einecha asisi leman titztak bedovrecha tizke b'shoftecha. Says the Zohar that David was like the court jester. He had said, "B'choneni Hashem v'naseini, test me." And the Eibishter said to him, "It's not a good idea. Don't expose yourself to be tested." So the Eibishter sent him a test. So David, he thinks like this: if I will withstand the test, I will be right and Hashem will be wrong. So instead, he succumbs and he fails the test, that Hashem should be right and he should be wrong. And we know the story in the Gemara says, because there was a get in there was a get in place. There wasn't an act of adultery, but it was still obviously immoral, etc. So he says, not I didn't violate someone else's wife, because there was a get in place. That you should be right and I should be wrong. Also steht in Zohar, and it says David bedicha de malka hava. He was like the court jester, and so I'll call upon him. That was a side comment. Let's go on. So someone asked me a question. Again, I don't remember where it was from, but is there a preference? Actually, it was from France. Is there a preference to have a haircut from a Yiddish barber? So even in Stamford Hill, there's a shortage of Jewish barbers. Baruch Hashem, one of our Ingalite does offer this service. So if someone wants to have a haircut in Stamford Hill, ask me separately and I'll introduce you to our Ingeman who's happy to do it for you. Okay, so now this is a quote from the Nite Gavriel. He has a whole sefer about opsher. So he says, Min hadin, you are allowed to have a haircut by a goy, but according to Kabbalah, one shouldn't have a haircut by a goyish barber because it removes from him the tzelem alekim. I don't understand what those words mean, but that's okay because it's from Kabbalah. And I don't purport to understand everything of Kabbalah. He quotes here from the Kaf HaChaim, quoting from the Mishnah's Chassidim. Mishnah's Chassidim was one of the, like a makabel, not direct, he was like a, should we say, an enikul or enikul, so to speak, of the Arizal, Rabenu Tam, and the Alter Rebbe has he sees the Mishnah's Chassidim. He says, Alter Rebbe is quoted as saying that everything which he says is Mishmei Arizal. So Mishnah Chassidim has it that one shouldn't have a haircut from a goy, etc. So we have here a hidur, of course. I once had a shaila. I'm going to digress for a moment. I had a shaila shliach. He asks me, he's somewhere in some Midwest in America, and he says, "What do I do about?" He was a Shnas Avelos Leider, Rahman al-Islam, and there's a shir that after you look, actually yigaru bechaveirov, until someone says you look like a tramp. So he says, in my place, it's kol amar beharei meshubach. What's a short haircut? Like, yeah, this is the normal to have long hair. So I told him that yigaru bechaveirov doesn't mean your mushpoim in the Beis Chabad. Your yigaru bechaveirov is your colleagues, your peers, your chaverim who you learned together within 770. Those are your chaverim. And if you would look like a tramp in their eyes, that's the heter for you. So coming back to our point that, okay, I presume he would have to have a haircut by a Goyish barber because there's no Yiddish barbers around there. Let's move on. This I got, someone knocked on the door on Motzei Shabbos. Someone, and he said he had made or heard Havdolo, but he hadn't davened Maariv. Does he have to say Ato Chonenantanu in Maariv, which is going to daven after Havdolo? So in other words, his Havdolo already. Does he still have to do a Havdolo again in davening? So it's a mufra. I told him right away that he does have to, but afterwards I wanted to look it up and I'm sharing it with you. So here we have from Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, and that's Siman Reish Tzadik Daled. The one who makes Havdolo on a cup of wine before davening Maariv, he still has to say Ato Chonenantanu in Shmona Esrei. Shari Iker Takonas Havdolo hoya b'tefillah. Shetiknush Anknes Agdolo kasheolam in Agdolo is laskir b'tefillah. Or we skip the brackets then. That the original takona was to make Havdolo in davening, and therefore, although you made Havdolo later, they were more comfortable, they were able to afford to make Havdolo in a cup of wine, but that doesn't detract from the original takana. The original institution was to make Havdolo in davening, to say Ato Chonenantanu. So even if you said Havdolo with a cup of wine, you still say Ato Chonenantanu in Shmona Esrei. The next piece is actually quite interesting. If a person, for some reason, overslept, and he did not daven Maariv and Motzei Shabbos, and therefore at Shachris he's going to say 2 Shmona Esreis. So the second Shmona Esrei is going to be the compensation for Maariv. So he would have to say Ato Chonenantanu in that second Shmona Esrei. Let's move on. Right. So here's another discussion which I had this week about V'anachnu lo neida manas at Tachnun. How does it work? So now we have here in the this is in Siman Kuf Lamed Aleph in Orach Chaim, the dinim of Tachnun. Now this is a quote from the Rambam actually. After the nefila of the prostrating oneself, which we do by lowering our head over our arm, right arm, left arm, whatever, Shachris Mincha. Al Kaponim after nefila sapayim yagbiya roishoy. You raise your head. Your face was down, and now you raise your head. And then you will say a bit of supplications while seated. Fine. So we say Tachnun, Nefilas Apayim, sit up, say a few phrases, and then we stand up, I presume. Doesn't say how much, what to say while you're seated. And I have a problem with this, by the way. What do you do on Mondays and Thursdays? Because right after you've Nefilas Apayim, you stood up for V'hurachum, and that's actually very strong emphasis. Written in Shulchan Aruch, very strong words, that V'hurachum has to be said standing. There's a Chassidish word. In V'hurachum, there are inyonim which are greater than some stuff which we say on Yom Neiroim. It's said every Monday and Thursday, therefore people don't give it the full seriousness, proper attention. V'hurachim is a very exalted prayer. Go upon him, that I don't have an answer to. I heard that Reb Sholem Morozov used to, at the end of V'hurachim, he would sit down for Avinu Malkeinu HaKotzer. But Roy Vanash, I have never seen this. And including the Rebbe, we didn't see him doing it either. Okay, having said that, now Mogen Avraham. Here we've got the Mogen Avraham. Kosav Bashalom. Roy loymar va'anachnu loyneda b'yeshiva ma'nase ba'amido u'shneihem b'koel rom. It looks like Nefilas Apayim is said quietly. And now you say va'anachnu loyneda ma'nase aloud, but then the Shalom quotes from an earlier source. He says he doesn't give an explanation. I looked it up in Shalom, that the words va'anachnu loyneda are said seated. Manase is said standing. Okay. So here, like we had before with the cookies, here we have a similar situation. We've got a Shulchan Aramo, and we've got a comment of the Mogen Avraham. And this comment is not brought in the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch. So it's the same situation. We're going to read the Alter Rebbe in a moment. And I want to say is that in the Kahos Siddur, the annotated edition, it was included in the instructions, this bit about to rise by Vanachnu Le'nei Manas. It was right, I don't remember the detail, but it's mentioned over there. One of our Choshev Talmidei Chacham and Rabbonim in Yerushalayim managed to read a bit of English, I guess, and he said, where did they get this from? The Alter Rebbe doesn't bring it. Help the Rebbe that also in the Kfar Chabad Siddur, which has got lots of notes. I find it actually very disturbing to have, as you're davening, got all those notes at the bottom. I'm sure you get used to it after a while to ignore the things. I mean, you ignore Pirush HaMilah, so why should you be worried about a couple of notes at the bottom? But in the Kfar Chabad Siddur, they also write that the Rebbe would rise at this point, and Hogas HaRebbe, they would rise at Banach L'Nei Manas. So now let's read the Alter Rebbe. L'achar shenofal al ponov, yagbiya roishev yischan in me'at b'yushev. And this, as I said, is the lashon of the Rambam. After having had your face down, you raise your head up, and you continue saying a bit of tachanunim seated. It's word for word from the Rambam. Now, ominag poshut loimar v'anachnu loynei manas. It's common to say the posuk v'anachnu loynei manas. Now, I'm going to ask you: is he saying that the minhag poshut is to say v'anachnu loynei seated, or is he saying it's a minhag to say that posuk? Now let's read further. And at first it looks like you meant to say Yusuf, and you say it's minhag to say the posuk v'anachnu loynei. But let's read further. What's the remez in the posuk v'anachnu loynei? The fish is palalnu b'chol inyan sheyodnu shuchal adam lispalel. What's happened? We've davened in all different formats. B'yeshiva, we've been davening seated, as in, I believe, Brichas Krishma. Over Amido, we've been davening Shemasa standing. Over Nefilas Apayim, we prostrated ourselves. Kasher also Moshe Rabenu Olav Sholem, Shenema Vo'ei Sheiv Vohor, I was seated. And it's interesting, the Alter Rebbe doesn't bring Vo'anoichi Amadati, which is brought in the earlier sources. Vo'es Napa Lifnei Hashem, and I fell, I prostrated before Hashem. So we are emulating, seated, standing, prostrating. We've tried all different postures. So we declare, we don't know, we've done what we can. That's as much as we know. That is why we're saying the posuk. So having now read it, I think it's not coming to say that the v'anachnu loynei has to be said seated. He's saying why we're saying v'anachnu loynei, because we've tried these different positions. Now, back to the minhag, which the Shalom quoting. Yeah, there is a something which said seated, and said seated, and in addition to what you were before, you were seated by Krishna, and Shmonesa, you were standing. So now in this pasuk also, you've got the variations of seating and standing. Masking. So coming back, having read the answer of the Rebbe to Rabbi Cohen, the fact that the Alter Rebbe doesn't quote this.
So that's the answer to Monday and Thursday.
No, it's not. That still remains a teku for the moment. Meanwhile, what I'm saying is the fact that Alter Rebbe doesn't bring this distinction of this extra pichivke, which the Shalom quoted the Magen Avraham, in Ishkiraya that we don't follow it. That's the answer which the Rebbe said to Rabbi Cohen. The fact that Alter Rebbe doesn't bring something, it doesn't mean he doesn't agree. And the word is then we say that on the poil we saw came by Kodesh Chazisicha, and the Rebbe was noyek to do it, and therefore that's good enough for me to say that is the correct minig. And why should the Chabad Davka be? It's enough with things where we're different to minig olam. We follow minig olam. Right. So now I see here on the chat a later Lubavitch Siddur states not on Monday and Thursday. This cannot be due to the order even on other days. Right, Nusach Ashkenaz, they have a different order. For them, it's easy to work this out. And then in the Rabbi Yaakov Emden Siddur, he says that the first part of V'hurachem is said standing, and then you've got the piyut of Hashem Elokei Yisrael, Shuv Becharei Napecho. He says from that point you should be seated. So that's how he's Mekayim, the Inyan of the Yischan Me'at Miyushiv. But as again, we have a Maaseh Rav. We see what the minig has been, and Ruba Kekula Falanash do not sit down after V'hurachum. So that is the minig at least in Chabad. It's fallen away. Fine.
Diane,
go on.
As you said, even the Indian is lavdafke to sit and stand by Vanachnu Leneda. We're saying we've already sat down by time, we stood up by V'hurachum, and we don't know what to do else.
Yeah, but then we've got this Magen Avraham b'Shem Hashalom, that there is a minig by those words of Anachnu Leneda to say seated and Manasa to stand up, and so we follow that. All right, let's move on. Difficult question. A woman tells me that she writes to me that her aunt lived to 98. She had for many years, she had a non-Jewish carer, very devoted, and the cousin, the daughter of this aunt, had a weakness for gambling, and she was constantly in need of money, and she would go to this carer, and this non-Jewish carer lent her more and more money, and now that the aunt has passed away, I guess there's an estate, and so now the aunt is the carer wants her money back. It's quite a substantial sum, several thousand euros. And the borrower is this, as people never with addictions, is trying to get out of paying. And the carer is going to this lady who asked me. She says, you were involved, you saw, and she wants her to support her in court, etc., to get the cousin, the borrower, to pay what she's owed. So she's asking what should be done. And so it is a difficult question because you're testifying for supporting a goy against a yid in court, but you know that the goy is the honest cause in the case. So I've got here a quote from Pischei Choshen, and he's quoting here from various sources. And he says about the union of Kiddush Hashem. And he writes the following. He's quoting here from Be'er HaGoyla, which is from Moshe Rivkus on the margin of the Shulchan Aruch. And then he writes the following. It's already widespread the minik that the Anshe HaKohol Oimdim Al HaMishmar, that the people who are kind of in charge of the community will be on guard and alert, not to allow people to deceive the people of the other nations, the Goyim, the Gentiles, and they would announce and give permission to publicize the names of people who borrow, who take on credit or borrow and have no intention of paying. hakol midas hamanhigim. And what I said to her is, if you don't testify, then actually you are accomplice to the dishonest behavior of your cousin. And of course, she's concerned that her relationship with her cousin has been strained all these years. And if she testifies against her, that will obviously make it much harder to ever reconcile. But on the other hand, I felt actually it would be a chilul Hashem if she would turn around and say, I can't testify, because the person says, you are an honest person. And there is money in the estate, and I'm entitled to be repaid. And so I felt that she is actually obliged to cooperate with this. Right. Finally, we have another couple of minutes, almost. Our last question here is about tzedakah funds. And so the Beis Chabad have a view for the future to set up a building. Meanwhile, they have, for their running costs, they have enough. So they want to put aside funds for a future building project. What are now about investment? Now, when you go to invest money, you are given the options of high risk, low risk, medium risk. And so what's the story? So first of all, as an overall principle, is it appropriate to invest tzedakah money rather than spending it on good things now? So here we have a letter of the Rebbe. In answer to your letter for your Gimel Tevis, this is actually the year where I was born. I was born Yud Aleph Tevis that year. That's Yud Gimel Tevis. In welche ihr fragt mein Meinung? You're asking my opinion about distributing the money of tzedakah or make a long-standing fund, which in other words, which will pay dividends, etc. So the Rebbe writes, generally it's more correct to distribute the money, because then all the money will be used in bepoyal. As Chazal say, the Eibishter gives a person an opportunity to do a mitzvah, and one shouldn't delay doing so. In your case, it would be, you're talking about creating a fund, and only the profits of the fund will be used for good things. So the Rebbe seems to be more encouraging to use the money now for good things. And what we understand very clearly is the Rebbe sees investment in nefoshes. And so you've got here people, if you spend the money now, you'll be able to, on whether it's hafotza, whether it's chinuch, etc., you're going to invest in people. So instead of having the money invested in the bank and paying dividends, you'll bring more people into Yiddishkeit. Okay, so that's if there was the option of spending it now, then that would be. But here it's clearly for a building fund, which is a different story. It's clearly for long term. So then we're back to our question: high risk or low risk. So here we have in Shulchan Aruch, it's talking about funds which belong to orphans, and then if Beis Din would employ a commission someone to be an apotropos, which means a guardian. And he writes here, he uses a lotion of korev l'schar v'rochik lehefsid, that the probabilities should be that it's likely to be profitable and far from coming to a loss, reaching to a loss. So perhaps it's not totally correct, but I think the high risk means that there is a korev lehefsid. So my impression is, I might be wrong, I haven't got better sources than this. My impression was that it's not your funds, it's soccer funds, and it should be put in low, perhaps maximum medium risk, but not in high risk, because you say it should be korev l'schar v'rochik lehefsid. That's my impression. If someone who listens to this later will get back to me, I'll share with you the information next time around. And meanwhile, I wish you all a gute Nacht and a guten Shabbos, and alles soll sein gesund, Tomit kol hayomim.
Ja, shkach,